This knife has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin. I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, mainly surrounding true crime, as well as a little bit of university and lifestyle sprinkled in where I can. So today I'm back with another true crime case, and today we're going to be discussing the disappearance of Lorene and RAHN, who disappeared from her apartment when she was just 14 years old. So if you want to hear a little bit about the case, then keep on watching and we shall just get started. As I said, Lorene's case takes place in the year of 1980 when she was just 14 years old. Lorene lived with her mother. Her name was Judith. They lived together in the third floor apartment in an apartment building in Manchester, New Hampshire. Lorene was a very, very talented and driven young girl. She was in love with singing, dancing, acting, everything performance related. She wanted to be an actress or a performer, and as well as being so good at her hobbies and being so driven in her kind of things in her personal life, she was incredible at school. She was maintaining really, really good grades in all of her subjects. On Saturday the 26th of April 1980, Lorene had asked her mother if she could stay at home in the apartment alone since it was spring break and her mother was going to be going out of town with her mother's boyfriend. So Judith and her boyfriend would be leaving town because Judith's boyfriend was a professional tennis player. So while he had matches out of town, usually both Lorene and Judith would join him, but this time round Lorene had wanted to stay at home while her mother went alone. So obviously, as you can imagine, Judith initially was a little bit hesitant since obviously Lorene was only 14 years old and usually she went with Judith to these tournaments out of town so she could keep an eye on her. But her mother said that since it was spring break and she'd been doing so well in school that she decided to let her do it, and she even let her have some friends over. So when Judith left for her trip later that day, Lorene invited two of her closest friends round, one male and one female, and they pretty much just spent the whole evening in the apartment chilling, kind of chatting. They even had a little bit of alcohol, which they knew they shouldn't have, but since Judith was away they knew that they couldn't really get in trouble for it. And then a little bit into the night, Lorene and her friends were obviously having a little bit to drink. They were watching some TV, having a laugh, when Lorene's male friend realised that he could hear some voices out in the hallway just outside the apartment, so sort of on the floor of the apartment. Now he immediately panicked because he had assumed that these voices were coming from Lorene's mother and Lorene's mother's boyfriend, as they had maybe come home early and he didn't want to get caught, you know, doing things that they shouldn't have been doing, i.e. the drinking. So he decided to kind of run. He ran out the back door of the apartment and Lorene kind of locked it behind him. So he remembered hearing Lorene lock that door behind him after he left. Then after he left, Lorene heard the voices herself and she was apparently straight away to lock the front door because she knew that the voices in the hallway had not belonged to Judith and her boyfriend. They hadn't thought too much of it at the time, and Lorene's female friend decided to stay with her in the apartment. She was going to stay the night with Lorene. Despite, you know, their friend kind of panicking, they obviously just had a little bit of a laugh about it. And then at around midnight that night, Judith arrived home into the apartment after being out of town with her boyfriend, and the first thing she noticed when she reached the floor of her apartment building that her apartment was on was that each of the light bulbs in the hallway leading up to the apartment had been unscrewed, and so the entire hallway was dark. Now this might seem a little bit strange, but also I suppose you could kind of brush it off in that sort of environment as perhaps just being a coincidence, maybe someone doing maintenance work on the building since it wasn't her home, you know, since they were in an apartment building that they didn't own. And so she just continued straight towards her apartment, but then she also noticed that as she entered, the front door was unlocked. Her first port of call was to head into Lorene's bedroom just to check that she was okay, and when she entered her bedroom there was a female figure, so the shape of a young girl in the bed, so covered up by the bed sheets, and obviously she had no reason to suspect anything else. She assumed that Lorene was in bed, she didn't want to wake her, so she just left her and went to bed herself. But then it wasn't until a few hours later when Judith woke up and realised realised that the girl in Lorene's bed wasn't actually her daughter, and it was actually the female friend who had stayed with Lorene that evening in the apartment. She immediately asked her where her daughter was, you know, why wasn't she in bed, and the friend just simply replied with that when she went to bed in Lorene's bedroom, Lorene had been on the sofa in the front room asleep, and yet Lorene was nowhere to be found in the apartment. At this point, as I'm sure you can imagine, Judith was extremely concerned for her daughter's well-being, so she began searching the apartment, assuming that maybe she'd fallen asleep somewhere, or she'd been stood outside or something, she'd just gone for a walk, and there'd be some reason as to why she wasn't in the apartment when she was supposed to be. But all she found around the apartment was a number of pieces of Lorene's clothing, as well as her brand new trainers that Judith said she wouldn't have left behind, like she would have been wearing. And as well as this, the back door had been left open. Sadly, after this day, there had been no reports or sightings of Lorene, where she could have been, what could have happened to her, despite being missing since that day. There was, however, a number of strange occurrences that happened after that day that she went missing that have kind of been built up and added into the case revolving the investigation into Lorene's disappearance. Just 3 weeks after Lorene's disappearance, a young woman, now I'm sorry if I butcher the name, it's Denise Denault, I believe, she disappeared within the same area of where Lorene disappeared. Not only this, so she lived in the same area, she lived about 2 blocks away from Lorene and her mother, and she actually went missing from a bar in the local area within Manchester. So not only had she gone missing in the same area, but many people have pointed out just how similar Denise and Lorene looked. Despite Denise being 25 years old at the time, they both looked eerily similar in appearance, so a lot of people think that there may have been some connection here with perhaps a serial abductor who maybe has a type. So Denise's disappearance was actually pinned on a serial killer. His name was Terry Peder Rasmussen, I believe. I'm sorry again if I can't pronounce that correctly. He had been living in this area under a pseudonym, so no one had known about him being a notorious serial killer. He'd been living under the name Bob Evans. Rasmussen wasn't incarcerated until years later in 2003, when he pled guilty to murdering his wife while he was living with her in California, and then 7 years later he died. However, in retrospect, many people and investigators alike have theorised and argued the likelihood that Rasmussen may have potentially been behind not only Lorene's disappearance, but also a number of other disappearances that occurred in the same area at the same time when he was known to be living there under this false name. He's also been allegedly linked to other murders such as the Bear Brook murders, which I believe was actually involving his biological daughter as a victim. So there's a lot on Rasmussen as a killer himself, but a lot of people have since, in retrospect, theorised that now knowing what we know about his whereabouts, could he have perhaps been involved in some way in Lorene's disappearance? And then for Judith, Lorene's mother, strange occurrences would happen for a long time following her daughter going missing. On the 1st of October of the same year that Lorene went missing, Judith discovered that she had been charged on her phone bill for a total of 3 phone calls made to a couple of different locations in California, and she immediately noticed that this was extremely strange because she had no ties to California whatsoever. She didn't have any friends, family, acquaintances, anything in California that would have warranted her to make a phone call there, and so she decided to investigate this further. So she found out that 2 of the phone calls had been made to a motel in Santa Monica, while the 3rd one had been made to a motel in Santa Ana. And this one in particular, she later found out, was actually to something that was referring to itself as being a teen sexual assistance hotline. When she'd informed investigators of this as being potentially something that they hadn't seen before, they hadn't had any sort of belief of Lorene having any ties to California, but then seeing all these phone calls, she told investigators, and they immediately decided to track down sort of whoever it was that was running this teen sexual assistance hotline. And this man, he worked as a physician, so he kind of had the knowledge, but he denied having anything to do with Lorene. He said that he wasn't aware of this phone call whatsoever. However, 5 years down the line, he for some reason changed his story. He suddenly came up with all this information that probably could have been a lot more useful 5 years prior. So this man began to say that around this time, in the same sort of time of Lorene's phone call, or the phone call being made from Judith's home, there'd be a number of girls that would turn up at his home. They were all teenagers and they were all runaways, but they would come to visit his wife. And it was at this point that he said that he couldn't completely deny that one of them wasn't Laureen RAHN. He said that it was a very, very strong possibility that one of them could have been Lorene. He continued these claims by saying that there was a woman named Annie Sprinkles, and she was a really close friend of his wife. She worked as a sex educator. She was an ex-pornographic actress, and she would sort of give this advice to these young runaways who needed sexual assistance. And he claimed that this woman named Annie Sprinkles would have some potentially pertinent information into not only Lorene's whereabouts, but also a number of the whereabouts of all of the runaways that contacted his wife. And despite the amount of detailed information this man gave about this woman and the hotline, investigators failed to find any links. So people have since speculated that could there be some sort of pornographic ring involving these teen runaways where they have been taken away seemingly under the illusion of being in a care and then obviously being exploited because of them reaching out for this assistance where they couldn't find it elsewhere and they didn't have homes. But then people have then said, okay, well, even if this is the case, why would Lorene have been involved? She had a home, she had a caring mother, so there's a lot of ifs and buts. There's quite a lot of theories around that, but it is all speculation because, like I said, investigators couldn't find any links between Annie Sprinkles and Lorene RAHN whatsoever. In 1981, the year after Lorene's disappearance, Judith told investigators that she had been receiving these really kind of strange phone calls. They were kind of regular, they weren't at a set day, she wouldn't receive them every single day, but they would be relatively regular, and they'd always appear at around 3:45 p.m. She said she wouldn't recognise the number, it'd be just from an unknown number or a withheld number. Around 3:45 p.m. she'd pick up and there would be no one speaking on the other end. These repetitive, strange phone calls would appear consistently for a number of years after Lorene's disappearance, and they'd actually increase in frequency around Christmas time. So many people, including Judith, have since said that they believe that perhaps it was Lorene who was alive and well somewhere. She was in some sort of maybe trouble or something, and this was her way of contacting her mother to make sure that she was still okay. And then sadly, a number of years down the line, Judith had to change her phone number, and so ultimately the phone calls stopped. And they hadn't really been able to find anything from these phone calls. They weren't able to trace them back to anyone in particular, and so sadly these didn't provide any answers whatsoever. In the same year that these phone calls began, a distant relative of Lorene's claimed that he was at a bus terminal when he just spotted Lorene stood there waiting for a bus in Boston, Massachusetts. And this family member had been completely adamant that it was in fact Lorene, but there was obviously no way to confirm this sighting. It was a passing, and so they was never able to prove whether it was correct or whether it was false. In the year 1986, Judith actually took it upon herself to hire a private investigator to see if they can visit the motels that the strange phone calls have been placed to in the year of Lorene's disappearance, you know, the hotels in Santa Monica and Santa Ana, just to see if they could find anything that they couldn't initially drag up from the original investigation. Now, the investigator actually discovered that the Santa Monica motel in particular was an alleged, so it was kind of like a well-known, but law enforcement couldn't actually find any direct evidence to stop it, but it was kind of like a known area. It was a known motel for a child pornographer who went by the name Dr. Z to shoot obviously his films in, and they had been kind of looking for this man for a long time, this law enforcement, but they'd never been able to actually find him. But it was believed that this was a frequented location for him to make his films. When this information was sort of dug up, law enforcement then obviously looked into it again. They couldn't find Dr. Z himself, nor could they find any links between this alleged child pornographer with the sexual assistance hotline that Lorene allegedly called. So there was, again, ifs and buts there. But if there is a link that just hasn't been found, it poses more and more questions as to where Lorene is. In the same year, a man named, I'm sorry if I pronounce it wrong, Roger Moraes, he received a phone call from a woman calling herself Laurie. So it was actually Roger's mother who initially had picked up the phone, and when she'd asked who it was, the woman on the other end said that she was a former girlfriend of Roger's. And this was a particularly important piece of information in the case because Roger and Lorene had actually been close childhood friends. And so not only was she calling herself Laurie, presumably a pet name or a nickname, but also that she said that she knew him a long time ago. People are piecing this together as Lorene's contacting different familiar people. But once again, sadly, nothing could come of this because there wasn't anything that they could have done about it. It had happened, they couldn't trace it, and she never called again. In the year of 1988, an anonymous tip had come in with a witness claiming to have seen a prostitute working on the streets of a place called Anchorage, Alaska, that allegedly matched Lorene's description to a T. But when this was investigated further, investigators actually started kind of disproving it because they realised that the description being offered by the witness, it had matched Lorene's description of what she would have looked like the same year she'd gone missing 8 years before. And so investigators kind of, when they couldn't find anything to link them, ultimately put it down to someone maybe making a mistake, because in all likelihood she would have changed in her appearance in 8 years, especially if she'd been working on the streets. So in the mid to late 1980s, Judith, Lorene's mother, obviously, she remarried and she moved away to Florida. She has been very public about her search for her daughter. She obviously doesn't want it to be forgotten or anything. She wants the search to continue. And she's actually made it quite publicly known that she believes that Lorene is still out there, that she doesn't know what happened to her, but she believes all of those phone calls and all of those sightings are likely to be Lorene on her different travels. On an unrelated note, a sad kind of piece of fact that I found while researching this case was that in the year of 1985, the male friend of Lorene who had been in her apartment on the night that she'd gone missing, who'd obviously freaked out and left, he sadly committed suicide in 1985, although he is known to be nothing to do with the case, so he was never considered a suspect. They don't think there was anything related, but it was just a really sad note that he isn't alive long enough to find out what happened to his friend. So investigators continue to act upon the suspicion that foul play was involved in Lorene's disappearance. Her case is actually classified as a non-family abduction case, and obviously in the initial stages there was a lot of rumours about her running away, but if you really go down into these runaway theories, you realise that there's so much you can pick apart from them, because things like she left all of her belongings, she wouldn't have been able to go without any of her clothes or anything. Obviously she wouldn't have just left while her friend was in the apartment. She would have gone, she would have invited her friends around. If her mum was out of town and she wanted to run away, she would have done it then. There's all these things that you can pick apart from it. So I would imagine that probably the most shared upon theory is that maybe she encountered some trouble or she enlisted help from the wrong people. And I mean, people obviously argued that she could be involved in this child pornography ring. She could have been sort of groomed and abducted and taken in, and so there's a lot of theories to do with that, but like I said, it's all speculation. There's a lot of ifs and buts, so let me know your thoughts down below on what you think happened to Lorene. My heart obviously as always goes out to her family, her loved ones, everyone who's been part of this case, because it's obviously awful not knowing anything about where your child could be. So I hope you guys found this interesting. Like I always say, feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section, as well as if there's anything that I missed out, anything you need to correct me on. Obviously I am only human and I can only access the information that is available online, so if you know anything to add, then feel free to add it. I don't mean to offend anyone by getting anything wrong. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you guys soon for another video. Thanks for watching. Bye.